Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the life and the career of the eminent psychoanalyst and social philosopher Erich Fromm. One of the reasons I'm going to talk about him is that he's a pivotal figure of mid-century thought in the 20th century, obviously. And also one that I think is immensely overlooked. Intellectual historians of the 20th century have a number of figures they tend to focus on. If you've ever read any of the works of Tony Judd, for example, he looks at the kind of the French philosophers, Sartre, Camus, Raymond Aron, and Polish figures like Leszek Kolakowski, and he's very interested in George Orwell. But a number of the figures from the Frankfurt School of social research get overlooked. Many of them aren't very fashionable anymore. They kind of had their heyday, I think, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when people like Herbert Marcuse, for example, was the voice of the new left on university campuses across America and Europe, and particularly in West Germany. And the Frankfurt School has very much declined in popularity. But I'm gonna make the case for Erich Fromm, and I've been kind of an adherent of his work for many years, and keep inbox periodically clogs up with the International Erich Fromm Society Journal. So yeah, this is a passion of mine, I guess. So who was he? Well, he was born in 1900. He was a German Jew who was born in Frankfurt am Main, and he trained in psychoanalysis in the 1920s. And the period, I guess, from the end of the First World War up until probably the mid-1960s, this is kind of the golden age of psychoanalysis, really until it starts to become far more challenged by more research-based methods of inquiry, probably from the 1970s onwards. So he's growing up in this period of time and studying in this period of time where psychoanalysis is seen as an orthodoxy, and he's a Freudian as well. So in short, and I say this really as a layman, for those that aren't kind of acquainted with psychoanalysis, that it is a therapeutic investigation of the unconscious mind and the largely irrational drives that are mysteries to us, that are ordinarily based in some kind of childhood trauma, and that these are the basis of neurosis. So Erich Fromm took what Freud had argued and adapts it and develops it. He was one of the generation of post-Freudian psychoanalysts who argued that, yeah, a lot of what Freud said appears to be valid, though there's kind of no way necessarily of empirically validating it, because much of it is kind of observational and anecdotal. But also that there are other reasons for trauma, other reasons for neurosis, other reasons for psychotic behaviour, drug addiction, suicide, and dysfunctional stuff like that. And he argued that he tried to create a synthesis, really, of Freudian and Marxist thought. So later on in his book, The Sane Society, and I'm going to come on to this, he argued that individuals who perhaps have not experienced childhood trauma in the classical Freudian sense can still be exhibit neurotic traits, exhibit neurotic and psychotic behaviours, because they're surrounded by an alienating society, which is a far more Marxist kind of concept, and it led him in the same society to question whether capitalism and all its productive power was indeed good for the soul at all, and he argued really not very. And Erich Fromm had to be one of this entire generation of German Jewish socialist intellectuals to flee Nazism in 1933, as if being Jewish in the eyes of the Nazis wasn't bad enough. Espousing the works of both Marx and Freud at the same time really did put him on very high on the hit list. Other intellectuals who left were Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and some of the very big names at the Frankfurt School of Social Research. The Frankfurt School itself is, there's not enough time really in this podcast to talk about it, but one of the kind of the real cradles of radical 20th century thought, and it is where many of the kind of the more influential ideas we have about sociology, about cultural theory, about examining how individuals interact with cultural phenomena, and how hegemonic ideas like capitalism and communism sustain themselves through culture. They really originate to a greater extent from the observations of the Frankfurt School. Now, a lot of the stuff that many of the leading proponents of the Frankfurt School have espoused have largely become superseded and have been kind of replaced by more adequate theory as the 20th century has rolled on. But it doesn't mean to say that they're not valuable. I mean, after the Second World War, particularly, I think you can probably say from the 1960s onwards, theory itself seems to dominate university departments. If you are going to be studying Shakespeare or Dickens or E.P. Thompson's history and making of the English working class or what have you, you do it through the perspective of theory, whatever that be, and it's normally something that has originated from this kind of meeting of psychoanalysis, Marxism, and then later kind of postmodernism as well, but God knows there isn't enough time in the world to talk about that. So the Frankfurt School is enormously important, and if you are looking at anything from a critical or theoretical perspective, it's worth really looking at some of the core texts of the Frankfurt School. So you would want to read perhaps One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, or The Culture Industry by Theodor Adorno. But coming back to Erich Fromm, when Erich Fromm was, he makes this transition to the USA and starts to study at Columbia and teach and lecture at Columbia University. And America during the 1930s is this massive recipient of talent from Germany. Germany's loss is America's gain. People like Fromm working in academia, but you've also got everybody from people like Fritz Lang, for example, the great director of Metropolis, making his way to Hollywood, and countless emigres, directors and writers like Billy Wilder, fleeing Germany and then later Austria after the Anschluss. So Erich Fromm's not a kind of an isolated figure. It's well known that there is this kind of wave of intellectual emigres from Europe, and he spends the Second World War in America, and in 1940 he writes one of his more famous books, The Fear of Freedom. In that he tries to use psychoanalysis to explain the appeal of authoritarianism and fascism, and this is something that was a very popular idea between the 30s and the 50s. Another great proponent of this explanation of fascism is Wilhelm Reich, who essentially says that it is down to some sort of kind of repressed sexuality, and he writes his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and he argued in it that really Nazi voters were looking for some kind of stern father figure that was often represented within German culture, and that authoritarianism and sexual repression seemed to go hand in hand, which are all wonderful theories, but whether they're based on any real evidence is questionable. The thing you have to bear in mind about Wilhelm Reich is that also he had a theory about orgones, sort of this orgasmic energy that could be trapped and harnessed in a sort of a tinfoil lined box and then directed at clouds in order to burst clouds and create rainfall in the desert. If you've ever seen Cloud Bursting by Kate Bush, featuring Donald Sutherland, it's a recreation of Wilhelm Reich's experiments, and he then began to commune with UFOs. So you got to take what he says with a pinch of salt. However, Erich Fromm, I believe, had far more kind of cogent and coherent and meaningful observations on fascism. He said that there was, like Wilhelm Reich, he did believe there was a kind of a mass psychology of fascism, but he said it was more to do with the alienation of individuals. By alienation, he meant that one of the transformative effects of capitalism was that it alienated individuals from the means of production. Therefore, craft industries had long since died out. People had worked in factories, and then there were periodic economic depressions where people don't even wind up doing that. And so people's creative forces, their ability to do things, their ability to see the products of their labours at the end of the day, is rapidly dwindling. And this is a profoundly disorienting and fearful experience, and therefore retreating to some kind of imagined notion of the past is very comforting, and that's what someone like Hitler represented. Security in a constantly changing and insecure world. The book, however, as I mentioned earlier on, that Erich Fromm writes, that I think is perhaps his masterpiece, in 1955, he writes The Sane Society. And The Sane Society was written during this kind of moment of explosive American wealth and affluence, the likes of which I suppose America's never really quite seen again, in this kind of rapid increase in living standards, consumer choice, and affluence. And he said, well, in the midst of all this material abundance, you still have high incidences of violent crime, of depression, of neurosis, and mental illness, and suicides, particularly, he observed, and drug addiction and alcoholism. He said, well, why is this? And his argument was that whilst America America as the kind of the apogee, the pinnacle of capitalist production, whilst it can produce all manner of material goods very efficiently and can drive up living standards, what it can't do is provide for deeper human needs. And Erich Fromm said that these are the need for authenticity, to be able to express oneself authentically to others, to have meaningful relationships, friendships, the ability to love and to be loving in an authentic way. And he said, if anything, what modern capitalism does is it steers us in a completely different direction, and it encourages people to be inauthentic. Erich Fromm identified this a notion called the marketing personality, and he said that in every mode of capitalism you have a particular character type emerges. He says, under the 19th century mode of capitalism, when it was all about kind of expansion and building and factories and railways, you had to have a very austere personality type emerge. The Victorian bourgeois gentleman who was emotionally and sexually repressed because his entire focus was on conserving and hoarding wealth which was hard come by. In the post-war era, we see the development of what Erich Fromm calls the marketing personality, and these are individuals who have to be in a constant process of selling themselves. They have business cards, they have a narrative about themselves, a story of success that they like people to know, and so they engage in this endless superficiality. They wear a mask, if you will, and project an image of success which really is not kind of consistent with inner realities, inner feelings and senses of doubt and loneliness. And this, he said, is the route to madness. You only need to look at modern versions of this, reality television or things like The Apprentice or what have you, to realise that there is still that this culture of the marketing personality is still endemic, really, within Western, perhaps even you could even say global society now, as this is these kind of cultures are a worldwide phenomenon. Erich Fromm liked to integrate. He was obviously this fusion of Marxist and Freudian thinking, but also he liked to return to the Talmudic law of the Jewish faith, and he liked to look at the stories of the Torah, the Old Testament, and see that there were notions within there which could be argued to be universal human truths. And this is particularly if you look at the idea of the Garden of Eden. It says what the Garden of Eden is, and Genesis is a metaphor that Adam and Eve, when realizing their nakedness, ultimately the problem for them is they realize that they are separate from nature. And it says that this is true of human beings. Human beings are from nature. We have evolved from nature, but now we become self-aware. We have the ability to see ourselves as separate from nature, and thus this sets up some kind of personality crisis. This means that he said man is the only animal for which his own existence is a problem that he must solve. And we can never return back to nature. We can't go back down the evolutionary ladder, and so we are stuck with this dilemma of trying to find meaning in the world. Now that we are who we are, what do we do with that? How do we create purpose? And he argued that modern consumerist capitalism doesn't really address that issue. Not that it's completely useless, it's good for making things, but the question of what do we do in the world, who are we, how are we to be, what's our purpose, it can't do any of that. And hence it leads to ever greater degrees of emotional distress. Now, there are obviously probably a range of other interpretations as to why people are happy, people are sad. I mean, of course, there's going to be, but I think one of the values of the sane society is it presents a very kind of interesting and coherent argument. At the end, Erich Fromm puts forward a number of very radical suggestions about what can be done. He says ultimately that he hopes that one day some kind of new culture will emerge that will be kind of far more in tune with humanistic needs. But taking a quick glance at the papers, I'd have to say that is yet to occur. Anyway, that's I guess kind of my book suggestion for the month. I'd suggest everyone go out and grab a copy of The Sane Society. You'll have some valuable insights if you do. I genuinely believe, and I would my personal hopes, if you will, is that Erich Fromm is far more widely recognised as being one of the pivotal thinkers of the 20th century, and I think for a lot of the time he's slightly seen as a peripheral figure, but that he certainly isn't. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. Thank you, bye bye.